Welcome back. We are at the final stretch. If it's your first time joining us today, you want to catch later, you got to subscribe to Container Solutions. They'll be up next week, the recordings. If you've been with us all day, thank you for your dedication and your questions and your discussion. Keep that energy up for Jasmine's talk. And of course, keep sharing at hashtag capital WTF, lowercase is, capital SRE. I'm really excited to be here with y'all, and I hope we stay connected with at JK Riggins. You see it there. And I think this is a really interesting talk to end because there's this entire discussion of, is security the job of SRE as well? Because are their jobs too big already, and is burnout so high? It is. We learned earlier that 18 months is the average length of an SRE's career or time in an organization. We learned in the panel. I know we change a lot in tech, but that's burnout. That's a red flag of burnout when you have the type of retention issues. And then it made me think as well, this topic that Linux Foundation had their survey about a year ago, and it found that only 3% of developers thought they're responsible for security. A theme that has gone throughout is SRE of this conference. SRE is a conversation, and it's specifically an ongoing cross-organizational conversation about reliability. And I guess let's bring Jasmine onto the stage to discuss if that then extends to include security, because shit's on fire. But also, how burnt out are the SREs? So thank you so much. I welcome you, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful for everybody in the audience. Thank you for sticking around, and thank you to the sponsors as well. This is a wonderful event. Just really want to acknowledge everything that's gone into it. I'm going to give you a thesis statement up front. I think that security and SRE need to figure out new ways to collaborate, but I think that it is on management, and the best way we can empower ourselves is with data, such as what I'm going to share in my presentation today, and boundaries, the latter of which I've learned the hard way in my security career. So today, we're going to be talking about 372 million data points and a few strong opinions. This is a synthesis of some research, firsthand research I've done recently, using obviously a decent data set and a graph research model, and things I've learned in my career observing and often suffering until I realize that I need some boundaries. Thank you. Next slide. So I'm Jasmine Henry. I am a field security director at Jupiter One. My role currently involves a lot of research, applied research, and some security practice. Previously, I was a security director. I've spent my career at cloud native organizations, where there is often some pretty, I feel like it's cool, exciting, productive, blurred boundaries between security, SRE, DevOps teams. And I think these, kind of exploring that is really important and helpful. But that's it in a nutshell. A lot of the research I'm going to be showing today, the graph data model behind it, if you're the kind of person that really wants to dig in, it's open source. So if you want to go replicate this on your own, please do. And I will also share the data set with you if you want to email me. Next slide. So I don't know if I can pull off a technical keynote. I think it's up to the audience to decide whether or not I do. This is an experiment for me, so fingers crossed. I have a complex relationship with data, and I feel like it's important to put that up front. I think that a lot of us, perhaps especially those of us from underrepresented backgrounds, reach mid-level, senior level leadership positions in our careers by being more quantitative than anybody else around us. I've spoken to a lot of women in security and SRE recently who did not feel comfortable earlier in their careers, first 10, 15 years of their careers, acknowledging their identity as women, or, if applicable, as minorities. We were just better than everybody else around us to be taken seriously. So I am somebody who, my background's in analytics, and I've also tended to use a lot of data coming into meetings armed with these just PowerPoints full of charts. I think that's valuable, but what I'm discovering the further I go is that you have to balance that data with relationships. Easier said than done, but that's kind of my complex relationship with data summarized. So I'm going to be sharing some research and my opinions on the road ahead, which I think is something that we all need to work together on. Next slide. So I've got a story about floppy disks. When I was in grad school in 2015, I had a professor who worked his way through college, and this was 1982, so 6 years before I was born. And he worked for one of the big American automotive manufacturers in Detroit. And his job was to walk around wearing a belt bag of floppy disks, because at this huge automotive company, there was about 50 employees in the entire company who needed a computer, and things were such that he frequently had to stick a floppy disk in and provide support. I don't know how many employees it was total, but this was, probably about 5% of the employees in the company, really less if you include manufacturing employees, needed a computer. Today, if you were to wear a floppy disk for every device asset in a company, including cloud devices, it would weigh 10,000 pounds. And I feel like that is an example of how much the kind of attack surface has changed at our organizations in a lifetime. And that is kind of the crux of some of the research I've done. Next slide. So today, there is 564 cyber assets for every employee in an average or mean organization. I used a graph data model to kind of classify data from 1,270 organizations and break it into asset classes, which, for the purpose of analysis and not having to have a bunch of charts in a report that was graph-based, because it's not everybody's jam, I broke it into a couple asset classes. We've got user assets, data assets, applications, network, and devices. And then there's two categories I used as well that are kind of attributes of assets: findings and policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about most of these, but one thing that you will notice is that about 40% of the data from the modern organization is findings. And that's a problem. That's not quite ideal. I think that ratio of findings to policy represents the fact that we've got some work to do. Next slide. So just really quick overview of my research. I was trying to balance, giving a keynote with, being transparent about my methods. 1,270 organizations, 372 million data points on their attack surface, which is the assets and the findings and the policies. And here's kind of how it broke down as well. Happy to chat over email if anybody has any more questions, but I would love to get into the findings. So next slide. Oh, really quick terminology. Graphs are boring unless you're into them. But in a graph, you've got nodes and edges. This is the same type of graph that Facebook uses. I guess Meta now. Search engines use as well. And the reason for a graph-based analysis is that you can look at the relationships, which is where a lot of the interesting stuff comes in. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so first strong opinion. There is only one good reason to stay awake for 24 hours, and it is never your job, assuming you work in SRE, security, technology, or a similar field. If you have a job where you're a surgeon on call for 24 hours, it may be different, but you should really never be staying awake for 24 hours. Recent research from Tessian shows that two concerning things. The security all-nighter is becoming a thing, and that's not a place we should be as an industry. Also, security and by extension SRE teams are expected to work 11 hours more per week than any other team in an organization. And as I dug into this data and discovered that findings were so prominent, I kind of became a little bit irritated. I I feel like burnout as an idea, as a concept, takes up a lot of space. It takes up a lot of space at conferences. It takes up a lot of space in security publications. Like there's always articles about, oh no, security and SRE are burned out. No shit. And I feel like it's frustrating. I feel like it's not currently getting better. And I think that we may need new approaches to dealing with it. Next slide. So again, the average main organization has 120,561 security findings and backlog. This is often from tools that are shared by SRE and security teams, such as guard duty, cloud posture management, cloud intrusion detection, cloud monitoring systems are producing a crazy number of findings. When I tell this 120,000 number to my peers, I get one of two responses. The first response I get is yup, and the second response is actually I think that sounds kind of low. Which to me, the fact that we accept this is bizarre. I cannot imagine a world where it is acceptable, it's normal, it's not questioned to have 120,000 things to do. If you can imagine somebody in accounting who had 120,000 accounting alerts, receipts, I can imagine them raising their middle finger and going to find an employer that had more reasonable expectations. That's not to say that I've got an easy solution in these slides, because I don't. However, I think that there is value in acknowledging that the number of findings that we have in backlog is unhealthy. It's psychologically unhealthy to be in a space where you can never get to the bottom of this pile, and it indicates that there is some need for change. Next slide. So I think it's important, to recognize that findings are a huge percentage of enterprise data. I again have some strong opinions here. I think that there is a lot of room for technology to catch up with practice in this area, and I am hopeful that we will get better at figuring out why we have these sizes of backlogs. I have a hypothesis that one of the reasons we have such a high number of alerts is that cloud systems are a lot more chaotic than on-prem. And if you're trying to apply anomaly detection methods to the cloud, you're going to get a lot of false positives, a lot of duplicates, and a massive findings backlog. And that's something I'm going to be looking at later this summer in some of my research. What I'm really excited about is some cloud entropy stuff. And so, I think that the only good reason to ever pull an all-nighter is a LAN party, if you are voluntarily choosing to go to it. And I think that there's very much a sense that as security and SRE teams, we have not been crying wolf about how we're tired, we're burnt out, we're overworked, we need resources. And I think that we need to kind of advocate for ourselves, to our managers, to executives, and that perhaps doing that well, armed with data of, I've got 18,000 things in this particular queue that I cannot get to. I hope that there's room for empathy and new solutions within our organizations, as well as advancements in the technology that we're using. Next slide. So another strong opinion here. I think in the last 2.5 years, we've kind of had this really interesting tipping point in technology. And I think that a lot of times we're also busy, overworked, tired, running so hard that we haven't really stopped and thought about exactly what's gone down. So at the onset of COVID, um, there was this phenomenon where organizations were standing up new technologies overnight. Telemedicine, got stood up overnight. Sometimes remote payments, other technologies to remotely do business. These things went into production immediately. Previously, to deploy one of these may have been a 6 to 18 month innovation cycle for an organization. And there's research from Harvard Business Review Analytics that there really was a huge shift in how fast development product teams were expected to work. And we're never going back to what it was before COVID. This is a new expectation, is that we work very, very quickly. We produce things very, very quickly. It's changing the way that we've, approach architecting systems, but it's also having a huge impact on those of us who deal with the ops and the security side. And I think it's interesting to see, to acknowledge, and to discuss. Next slide. So again, kind of, in order to architect systems in ways that scale out, there's been this really fascinating shift in the asset mix at organizations, which is part of what I looked at. Static IPs are the 1%. I saw a lot more network interfaces, which just speaks to how we're architecting for reliability and flexibility. I think this has a pretty interesting implication for those of us who are considering, how do we uplevel ourselves as professionals, as well as those of us who are thinking about hiring and upskilling our teams. 10 years ago, as I was applying for security jobs, I had a lot of hiring managers say, well, you don't have, X amount of experience with real security technologies like routers. And I think that perhaps, premises-based networking is taking up too much space in security trainings and certifications, when what we really need to be considering is how do we provide, rising talent and teams with skills in cloud and SRE. Next slide. So again, we're not ever going back to the way that systems were developed and architected before COVID. So I think that the conversation that we're having, within our organizations, across teams of security, SRE, and with leadership needs to be, how do we painlessly manage 564 assets per employee? We're not in a space anymore where a huge organization has 20 computers. By any means, we're at a scale that we've never seen before, because our hyper reliable, agile architectures have a lot of pieces, and we need new methods. Going to be Captain Obvious here for a second. If an asset is manually deployed and managed, good example being a laptop, new employee starts, somebody in IT sets up their computer, hands it to them. You can probably kind of manage the security life cycle manually if you really have to. But when it comes to cloud systems, where the entire asset life cycle can take place in an automated way, you need automated approaches to security, to inventorying that asset, because manual does not scale to things that are automatically deployed. And again, we've crossed tipping point. There is no way that we will ever go back to prior speeds of development and prior architecture methods. So I think that as security and as SRE practitioners, we need to figure out how to collaborate better with developers, which has been a challenge for years, but there's new pressures applied to us. How do you embed requirements for security into the new developer platforms, where does a developer really need an alert every time they hit a boundary, or do they just need encryption, deployed by default because that is true for all systems? So I think that we need to think about making security painless and during development at speed, and also considering how we're relaying data from our feedback loops. And again, we're in uncharted territory here, so we really need to rethink skill and talent. Some of the conversations I'm part of that really excite me lately have to do with solving the skill gap by approaching security and SRE specialties as vocations. Do people really need a 4-year degree to be a specialist in a specific area? Probably not. And I think that those types of innovative approaches to training and skill excite me, because I believe that we're going to need everybody's involvement. We're going to need diverse teams, inclusive teams, and a greater recognized talent pool in order to deal with tomorrow's challenges. Next slide. Okay, so third-party risk is like a pile of horse manure. And there's a little bit of analogy here that I cannot personally take credit for. Credit goes to my CISO, Sunil Yu. So back in Victorian London, England, there was a problem with too much excrement on the streets. Everybody used horses as a primary mode of transportation, and being a population-dense city, there was too much horse manure on the streets of London. And the issue was that this problem could be managed, shovels, wheelbarrows, transport the poo elsewhere, but it couldn't really be solved because, you remove a pile, and by the time you get back with your shovel and your wheelbarrow, it's been replenished. And Sunil uses this as an analogy for third-party risk, for software supply chain risk, because we don't have solutions for third-party risk right now using current methods. We can only manage it or attempt to manage it. And I think that recognizing issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis that are akin to this problem of horse manure, like, we can do our best, but we don't have the current technology, the current methods to actually solve this is important. It's psychologically healthy because it's recognizing what we can and cannot control. Next slide. So again, yeah, Log4j was just the tip of the iceberg. In my research on 1,270 organizations, I discovered that there is an incredible amount of third-party code in our environments. Over 91% of code is third-party code, based on the fact that homegrown code has change management trails attached with it, PRs and things like that. So there's suddenly kind of executive and business executive recognition of the fact that third-party code is a security risk. It's scary because of Log4j, which is, nice in a way. However, I don't think that a lot of folks realize just how prevalent third-party code is. There's a ton of application assets code, and most of it's not developed in-house. I'm actually really pleasantly surprised and lucky that Jen referenced the Linux Foundation study, because I think that's an important thing to bring up as a solution that we all need to consider as individuals, as professionals, as community members. Very small percentage of open source developers do security work, and the majority of them consider it a very unpleasant chore. So I think that one of the big questions that we're grappling with as an organization is, how do we make security work pleasant for open source contributors? I don't have the answer. I just know that our organizations are very, very dependent on these open source libraries, and we need to figure out what it means to make security contribution fun, rewarding, worthwhile for contributors worldwide. Next slide. Third-party risk is unmanageable. There are things that we can use to manage it that are kind of like shovels and wheelbarrows. I apologize. My neighbor's dog across the street is really loud. But we can make progress with knowledge graphs. Like the graphs I use to do this research, our graph is in our GitHub. It's open source. Software bills and materials can show us what's in our environment, and vendor consolidation. I think that one thing that we can work on, collaborating between security and SRE, is to recognize which systems are taking too much to manage. In my experience, and I'm sure this is true for everybody else here, most organizations have a couple legacy systems that are not really mission critical, and they're older and they require a ton of resources to keep running and secure. And if these systems that are not offering that much value and are taking up this much time are really increasing third-party risk, that can be a great conversation to have with leadership about sunsetting the system because it is taking way too much time and introducing way too much risk. And again, that goes back to the boundaries, recognizing what does not serve you, what does not serve the organization, and coming up with new solutions to it. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I apologize if that was a duplicate slide. So the policy as code landscape is another thing I looked at. So a little bit less than, I think it was 10% of the data in the graph, it was 372 million data points, represented policy as code. And the majority of that policy is IAM policy. Smaller percentage was cloud policy. And I think that when you're talking about policy, the percentage ratio of policy is not really that important part of the conversation. Next slide. Ideally, the number of policies in an organization should be low from both a security and an SRE standpoint. What you absolutely want to avoid is one policy to control one user, to control one asset, because one-to-one ratios of policy to users is a huge workload. It's not sustainable, especially as the number of assets, that the size of our attack surfaces continues to expand. Right now, we've got a ratio of one policy for every 19 cyber assets, and I think that's actually way too many policies. I think that we need to be having discussions with security and SRE about how do we write a policy statement that effectively covers 10,000 assets. How do we navigate system absolutes, exceptions, better tag our data? These are the types of conversations we need to be having. There's tons of research out there that shows that we're not always doing the most effective job with cloud policy. But I think that recognizing that coverage of policy is the most important thing, is a way to move in the right direction. Next slide. So transitive risk is significantly underrated. And I feel like this is a huge part of my research. I don't think anybody in the entire world on any team in an organization ever wakes up and says, I don't give a flying Turing test about the security posture of our EC2 instances today. Like, that is not something that any of us say. Everybody is here in SRE and security because we care a lot. To be perfectly frank, there are easier ways to make a middle class living than doing the type of extremely difficult, long hours technical work that we do. So I think that many of us are here because we care. We care about security. We care about reliability. We care about uptime. We care about performance. And I think that's actually ultimately what gives me hope for the future is the fact that we really care about what we do, because that kind of dedication and energy is what's going to allow us to find solutions to the challenges that we face and have in common, especially if we're open within our communities about what we're trying to solve, because that allows us to create peer mentoring relationships and learn from others and collectively create solutions. Next slide. So again, I was looking at a graph which had all these assets, and it had relationships between the assets. And what I discovered is that first degree asset relationships are not everything. And I also had a lot of data that had to do with how security and SRE teams were looking at their environments, the queries they were using, the alerts they had set. And what I discovered was that most of us are looking at first degree relationships, and that indicates that we have blind spots. I don't think that we have blind spots on purpose. I think that we're exhausted and overworked and don't have the ability to look deeper. Example of a first degree relationship that would be a query is Jasmine, a user. Example of a multi-relationship query that talks about transitive risk is Jasmine, the developer who submitted a PR that made the vulnerability scanner scream at me. That's where you really begin to understand risk, is these kind of multi-system, multi-dimension relationships. And I think that I don't have even some of the answers and how that we get there, but being able to understand kind of like situational awareness is an ideal state for us, where we have enough kind of energy, time, cycles to be able to understand relationships between users and events, instead of just, does this thing exist? What is this, aspect of it? Next slide. So why complex relationships matter? I think I kind of, already discussed this a little bit, and it really has to do with, transitive risk and burnout. Next slide. Okay, so to kind of summarize all of my research, which is available for free online, email me if you want the data set, email me if you want to chat about it. Manual is unreasonable. Automation really should be the first and last resort for how we approach everything, how we approach giving requirements to the other teams, how we approach the security and SRE lifecycle. I think it is important to be open and honest about the fact that we are in uncharted territory, because that allows us to explore new approaches to collaboration and other new solutions. Relationships between assets and teams really matter. And as scale increases, it's only going to matter more. I think that findings, third-party risk, are both piles of horse manure where we don't currently have the solutions, and that being able to acknowledge things that cannot be solved, they can only be managed, is healthy. And it can allow for more productive conversations, and it can allow for healthier boundaries. We all have blind spots, but I hope, and I genuinely believe that we can get to the place where we know what we have, and we're asking questions about how posture, about how status changed. Next slide. So I have a book coming out May 3rd. Just wanted to acknowledge this really briefly. It's called Reinventing Cybersecurity, and it is a compendium of essays on security, on identity, on the work we do on strategy, by 19 women and non-binary people in security. It is going to be sold at a very low price. It's not a moneymaker. This community project on Amazon. It'll also be free on my company's website if anybody is interested. Next slide. Any questions?
Well, obviously, I'm going to be pitching to all my editors. I want to have you on the podcast because that was excellent. Point of correction, you called them opinions, which I thought was funny because, as you said, you made a wonderful, very inclusive point that those of us that are underrepresented in tech, and there are obvious degrees of that as well, tend to look for quantifiable qualifiers to verify our place. And I do see this among friends,
Yep.
among women and non-binary friends across industries, even in those that are deemed more feminine. That's a bullshit term, but I mean, like, whether
Right.
it's nursing or in universities and all, are always also finding they need to quantify their values more. But I would say you quantified so much that you can't even really call what you said opinions. They were facts derived from an excess of data.
I would say horse manure is an opinion.
Okay.
but
Fair enough.
it's also an analogy that helps me understand what I can and cannot control. And it helps me. I hope it helps others as well.
But I would say overall, you are making observations based on a lot of quantifiable data, and it was wonderful. And I really appreciated everything about it. And I guess, first of all, the comment was that wasn't your neighbor's dog. That was Essery's crying off into the distance based on that data. So that was an excellent comment from the peanut gallery
My
or the audience.
empathy.
I shouldn't
Yep.
say peanut gallery. Sorry.
Yep. The data is not fun to look at, but if anybody can take this to their CRO or whatever and say, this is what we're dealing with, and we're average, better than average, whatever it may be, and they get 2 more hires because of it. Like, I've done what I set out to do.
And to echo Charity Major's, also more tooling investment, because there's often a lot of budget to expand these teams,
Yep.
but not to expand the tooling and automation. And to reach elite level of the DORA metrics, et cetera, you actually need expensive tooling as well.
Yes.
And expensive people that you don't burn out. I think burnout, I'm not sure when they did the fire theme everywhere and it's on fire, but I actually think the people are on fire and we need to be more caring of our human beings. So
Right. Something that was really, really hard for me to learn in my career was how to fail. If you ask somebody for resources 3 times and they say no, it's not always the correct thing to do to kill yourself to get it done, to sacrifice your weekend, to stay up all night. Like, that's not the solution, because what it shows is that executives can rely on you to get it done, no matter what, no matter how bad it hurts. And that is, really, really tough lesson. But I think that, boundaries matter. And if we're open and honest about what we need and we're not getting it, like, that's kind of not on us at a point.
it's kind of basically why there's a great resignation, as they're talking about. Again, I can't reiterate enough. It's not about money in our industry, in our overly inflated tech bubble. It's about burnout and not being listened to. So how do you think you have personally, if I may ask, created boundaries in your work?
That's a really good question. I think that a lot of these decisions, pretty personal, pretty specific to my situation. In my prior job, I was managing a global team that had an 11-hour time differential from me. So I was kind of like, let's try to do meetings 2 to 3 nights a week. Didn't try hard enough to do that. And so for me, the right solution was to switch jobs to a job where I work fewer hours. It was a decision to focus on research right now, so I could focus on my health for the next year or 2. For me, that was the right thing to do. I think that organizations vary. Having technical leadership helps a lot if you're interviewing for new jobs, because I think that things vary a lot, but sometimes technical leaders can be a little bit more empathetic. It seems like I had another thought or two that have just completely fallen out of my head. I'm curious what you think.
I think one of the boundaries we're seeing coming up, and I think is actually one of those weird benefits from COVID, though I think you are right that we set a standard that was wonderful. We had this feeling of getting together the first 3 months,
Mm-hmm.
March, April, May, June, that there was a sense of purpose in the tech community, that people were working really hard because, well, we had nowhere to go. And if you
Yeah.
didn't have kids, though, if you did, that was really hard. You had this sense of purpose, you weren't going anywhere, and you were helping keeping the world spinning because the tech is the backbone that enabled grocery stores to make a change, things like that. So that was great. But then we hit the standard, and you're right, we've just kept it for 2 years going now. So burnout
Right.
is at the lower numbers are at 2/3 in the tech industry as a whole, I would assume, considering the rates, the lower retention rate in SRE is probably higher than that. So we have all of these happening. But one benefit of that is that there have been job sharing and moving to 4-hour work weeks. Do the 4-hour work weeks actually turn into 4 12 or 14 16-hour days? That's a problem. I highly recommend everyone read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, to talk about the problem with going down in hours and pay and then not actually going down in hours at all.
Hmm.
Excellent example, non-tech, though she's tech adjacent now, isn't she? But I think it is a really interesting prospect. Do you think SRE is something that could be job shared?
Yes. I also think there's a lot of room, and I hope this happens for specialists to do fill in on call depending on their expertise or familiarity with factors. I think there's room, and I hope that we figure out ways to make our work healthier.
That's wonderful. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to round out the conference. As a reminder, of course, I didn't remind you enough. So after this, go drink water, people. Take walks. I wasn't as good as I usually am online things. Don't work and attend conferences at the same time because, again,
Important.
we hit that cap of like this heightened level of excessive working. And that also means people aren't getting time off to go to conferences. It's actually really hurting the industry. It's burning out, and people are multitasking, half listening to conferences, half coding. It's just all very unhealthy. But I really thank you so much, Jasmine, for a really heartbreaking but wonderful and really important closing keynote that really gets the crux of y'all are, not me, are very data focused people. And you present it in a way that hopefully people can take back to their leadership, because this is not sustainable. And it's, of course, as Charity said earlier, happier employees or happier engineers create happier customers. It's full circle. So we have to work together. So thank you so much. Please all keep self-care.